are you responsible for? When you hear that question, what does it make you think? What does it even mean? When I think of responsibility, I think about people and money. Who am I responsible for? For taking care of my kids, my family, myself, my team. What am I responsible for financially? For our home, my business, making sure that my kids have food and clothes and lessons. The problem with when I think about responsibility that way, it feels heavy. It feels like a burden that I carry, things that I have to do. And the problem with that is that nobody wants that kind of responsibility. Nobody wants to feel responsible when things go wrong or are hard or are outside of our control. But the truth is that so much of our lives is always outside of our control. We can't control the conditions or circumstances most of the time. And yet we take responsibility. We take the blame on ourselves when things go wrong. We take responsibility for things that we don't even have the power over to do or to fix. My husband Mark and I knew we wanted to have kids, and I always knew I wanted to have 3 kids. But we worried that we might have a hard time because Mark had had chemotherapy for lupus when he was younger. So in 2015, we started our fertility journey, and it was hard. We went in for all of the shots and the ultrasounds and the poking and the prodding and the blood tests and all of the appointments. And one day I got a little bit pregnant. We were so excited that we were going to be parents, but a few weeks later I miscarried. I felt so responsible. I remember being curled up on the shower floor, and Mark was sitting outside the glass door asking me what could he do. But I didn't want anybody. I didn't want anybody's help. I was taking all of that responsibility on myself. It felt like my fault. Even though logically I knew that it wasn't. I knew that there was nothing I could have done differently. It still felt like my body had failed. It was my body's fault. I was responsible. I was taking what Navy SEALs Leif Babin and Jocko Willink call extreme ownership. It's where we take radical responsibility for everything that has happened or is happening. But the problem with that is that so much of our life is always going to be out of our control. We take, no matter what has happened, we take all of the fault, the blame, the responsibility. And it's exhausting. The good news is that we were able to conceive, and we had our daughter Guinevere in 2017 and our son Jonathan in 2019. We felt so lucky. Here I had taken all of this responsibility on myself when things had gone wrong, but when things were going right, we felt lucky. We felt like things were back in control. But of course, we never know when things are going to be taken out of our hands and be out of our control again. Mother's Day of 2019, Mark surprised me with tickets to France for my 40th birthday, which would be in November. 39 hours in Bordeaux on the ground, just the 2 of us. It was going to be a whirlwind trip. Blink and you might miss it. We were so excited. And we immediately started planning. Well, 2 weeks later, it was time for my annual review at work. And I was so excited. I had been at this job for 2 years, and I absolutely loved it. But instead of getting a promotion, I got laid off. We were reeling. We wondered if we should cancel that trip to France, but we decided to wait and see what happened. This was not the first time I had lost my job. I felt like I was failing at my responsibility. It wasn't the first time. In fact, it was the 3rd time in under 10 years, and I had had enough. I told Mark I was going to start my own business, taking everything that I'd learned over the past 10 years, working for multi-million-dollar companies, and I was going to start my own company, working with entrepreneurs, small businesses, and individuals to help them bring their big, bold dreams to life. My first goal was to make $5,000, and I did it by the end of August. And in October, I had my first $10,000 month, and my business was growing. So France was on, and we had an amazing time. We wandered through Bordeaux, eating delicious food, drinking incredible wine. It rained the entire time, but we didn't care because we were together. We reconnected with who we were as a couple before we had kids, before we got married. Mark even looked at me at one point and he said, I feel like I'm rediscovering the real you. Next week was Thanksgiving, which is my very favorite holiday. We hosted 25 people. Mark's parents drove in, my family, our best friends, and we had a beautiful day, just being together. And the next day, I walked upstairs to wake Mark up, and he was ice cold. And he wasn't breathing. And in the middle of the screaming and the running around that followed, I remember whispering, please wake up. I can't do this by myself. But none of it mattered. Mark passed away in the middle of the night from undiagnosed heart disease. One of his arteries was 95% blocked, and the other was 50% blocked. We had no idea this was coming. Now what? It's just me. I'm the solo parent and sole financial provider for 2 kiddos under the age of 3 with a brand new business. And I'm doing all of this without the love of my life and my best friend, and honestly, my biggest cheerleader by my side. It felt impossible. I wasn't responsible for my husband's death. I was, however, left with all of these responsibilities that the two of us had been shouldering together. I was responsible for my children, their welfare, their food, their clothes, everything. I was responsible for our home, my business, my life. And I could have shifted into radical responsibility, into extreme ownership, as I'd done before, taking everything on myself. But honestly, I didn't have the energy for that. There were so many days when I was curled up on the closet floor sobbing, not even knowing how to stand up. There are days and months that I barely remember. Life was harder than it had ever been before. I got through it, I don't know how. In fact, it wasn't until about a year ago that I was working with some of my mastermind students, entrepreneurs who were growing their business, and they were frustrated that they weren't getting the results that they wanted. And I said to them, we can't control the results. We can only take responsibility for what we're doing. We can't control the outcome. And I realized that was it. That was how I'd gotten through the months and the days after losing Mark. I didn't have the energy to control outcomes or even try. I got through by taking responsibility for just showing up, however I could. But not radical responsibility. Radical responsibility is all about duty. No matter what happens, it's all on you. And the problem with that is that it doesn't leave any room for grace or creativity or exploration or love. It requires us to take extreme ownership for everything that has happened or is happening. But the truth is, so much of our lives will always be outside of our control. So instead of taking radical responsibility, I started to shift into what I call radically loving responsibility. The difference is that we choose responsibility with an air of grace and creativity and loving kindness for ourselves and for those around us. We allow them to take responsibility for their lives, and we offer them the same grace and creativity and loving kindness. Instead of taking radical responsibility for how things turned out, I instead started taking 100% radically loving responsibility for how I showed up, and I released the need to control how things end up. Of course, these were devastating losses. And I would imagine that you've experienced loss as well. And there's a fear that we might experience another loss, that we might be responsible for how things turn out. We might be responsible for things going wrong, that they're outside of our control, for how things end up. And so we refuse to take responsibility for how we show up. And if that's the case, you're not living fully. You are so afraid of how things might end up that you risk living with that fear, bitterness, resentment, and regret. People will often ask me, how could you possibly go on after a loss like that? Well, I started to see that while we can't choose what happens to us, we can always choose how we respond. We always have the ability to choose our response. Responsibility. And I started to see how I was causing myself extra suffering when I thought that that wasn't the case. When I thought that there was one right way to respond, and I didn't have a choice in how I responded to my miscarriage. I didn't have a choice in how I responded to losing my job. Instead, when I saw that I could always take 100% radically loving responsibility for how I showed up, it didn't feel so much like life was happening to me. And so instead, when things get difficult now, I ask myself, where could I take more responsibility for how I'm showing up, for my role in the experience of my life? It's a question that you can ask yourself. Where could you take 100% radically loving responsibility for how you are showing up? Not for the outcomes. It doesn't mean that everything's going to go perfectly, obviously. But I'm always looking for those places where I can take responsibility for how I'm showing up. I can't control the outcomes of a conversation I have with my 5-year-old daughter when she misses her dad. God, I wish I could. But I can't ignore it either. I can, however, take responsibility for how I show up. I can be present with her. I can let the conversation unfold. I can pause and acknowledge how she and I are both feeling without trying to change it or judge it or make it right or wrong. I can offer to blow kisses to the moon or watch a video of her dad or just give her a hug. I'm not always able to control the outcome of my business, but I can take radically loving responsibility for how I show up, for my role in the experience of my business, for how I show up for my clients and support them as they take the damn chance on themselves, for how I show up for you here today. I stopped thinking that when things went right, I was lucky, and when things went wrong, it was my fault. And instead, I recommitted to always taking radically loving responsibility for how I show up, which meant I was willing to take responsibility for things going right. All of a sudden, I was willing to take the other side of responsibility, not the heavy side, not the dutiful one, not the one that everybody wants to get rid of, but the loving side. And what if we don't do that? We feel like a victim. We become a victim. We think that life is happening to us. And we risk becoming a victim and becoming defined by the very circumstances that we face. Sure, you might pay your bills and your kids are dressed and educated, but you will have lived in fear of what you could be responsible for. And you won't have lived fully. You risk living with regret. And no one else is ever going to have to live with your regret. When Mark passed away, we were just about to start our next round of IVF to transfer an embryo and have the third child that we'd always dreamed of. And with Mark gone, that dream was gone. Or was it? I was in the unique position where I could have our child on my own, using an embryo that we had frozen before he passed away. I could fulfill my dream of having 3 of Mark's children. And so 1 year, almost to the day after Mark passed away, I got the call from our doctor that I was pregnant with our child. And in July of 2021, I gave birth to my daughter, Mark's and my third child. Her name is Mirastella, which means miraculous star. But not a miracle because we got lucky. She's a miracle because of my own making. She's a miracle because I chose and always continue to commit to taking 100% radically loving responsibility for how I show up, for my role in the experience of my life, for living a life without regret. Because we don't know what's going to happen. We never know at any moment what's going to happen to our loved ones, to ourselves, to our jobs, to our home. But that's not a reason to live scared. It's simply a reason to live fully. Thank you. Give me Do you want to wave? All right, come on.